We completely underestimated Hamas. We saw the signs, we brushed them off, and we assumed that there was no way Hamas would ever follow through with something like this. They spent years monitoring nearly 100,000 IDF soldiers online. Everything I thought I knew about Israel's security was shattered in one day. Welcome everyone to the very first episode of Off the Record. I'm Zina Rachamilova, and this is my attempt to bring something back into the conversation that feels like it's almost extinct, which is nuance. We are living in a moment where anyone with a phone can become a commentator, a journalist, or a geopolitical expert. And social media platforms like TikTok and X move faster than facts can, and misinformation spreads long before truth even has a chance. And all of that is magnified when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. I think the biggest challenge for us is that we've lost the ability to have balanced dialogue with each other about policy, history, or lived experiences. We hear all the time that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and of course it's not. The majority of people who support Israel have always reiterated that. And if you read any of my columns, you'll see the countless times I myself have criticized my government and their policies. However, the anti-Israel movement in America and in Europe is driven by anti-Semitism. There are probably plenty of people who go to these anti-Israel rallies that are well-intentioned, although ignorant, in my opinion, who just want to see the end of suffering in Gaza. But the movement behind these protests and the fake news that they disseminate are anti-Jewish, anti-American, and anti-West. They push this idea of anti-normalization against Jews or Zionists so that the mere idea of interacting with us becomes morally and socially unacceptable. They frame any engagement with us as a betrayal or complicity rather than as a potential path towards dialogue, understanding, or conflict resolution. So what has that led to? Well, as a Jewish person and as an Israeli, it has become impossible to have nuanced discussion about the conflict and about the Middle East. We are left with a situation where most of the time, the people involved in the so-called criticisms are not trying to improve the situation and don't actually want to have dialogue and learn. So engaging with these critics becomes this one-sided, endless bashing fest against Israel, where Palestinians or their leadership are absolved of any responsibility. It's really become difficult to have conversations when people are tossing around these grandiose statements and accusations like apartheid and genocide, because those terms do not accurately represent the situation here. I, for example, can sit here and have a debate with anyone about the occupation or about the future of the West Bank, and I can acknowledge that it's unfair for Palestinians to be subjected to some of the things that they have to go through. But if you are labeling the situation as an apartheid, which it's not, or you're minimizing the very real security concerns that Israel has to go through, or ignoring the long history of terrorism that Israelis have been subjected to, then I cannot have a real conversation with you, because you don't care about facts, you don't care about peace, and you don't care about Jewish safety in the region. Which leads me to my initial statements, that we are so busy dealing with bad faith actors who are spreading lies and misinformation that having nuanced dialogue has become impossible. But what I've realized in the last 2 years is that there's a huge audience of people who are craving balanced conversation. So this podcast is my answer to that. This is a place where we slow things down, where we take the hard conversations seriously, where disagreement is welcome, but dehumanization is not, and where we talk about Israel and the region with the honesty, context, and the complexity that it deserves. So, thank you so much for being here and choosing depth over noise. Let's get into it. It's been over 2 years since the October 7th attacks, and now that all the living hostages have been released, many Israelis are finally demanding for a commission of inquiry. Just days ago, Tel Aviv's Habima Square was packed with protesters who were demanding for an official state commission of inquiry to be led by the judiciary. Among the attendees were former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, the current opposition leader Yair Lapid, and the members of Knesset Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, and Yair Golan. These protests are in response to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government announcing that they would launch their own internal commission of inquiry. According to Hebrew media reports, the Netanyahu government inquiry would be determined by cabinet ministers, which would mean that the government itself would decide what the inquiry could investigate, how far it can go, and what it could publish. So it's prompting a lot of backlash in Israel. Now, why is this important? Because since day one of the war, the question that's been on everyone's mind has been how? How could something like this happen? For years, we've lived with this false sense of security that Israel's superior and sophisticated military intelligence and technological edge gave it this unshakable advantage over its enemies. And how can you not believe that after all of Israel's other spectacular victories against Hezbollah and against the regime in Iran, when you think about the Beeper operation or about the assassination of former Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, or that Israel was able to operate freely in Iranian airspace in a matter of days during the 12-day war. How can anyone think otherwise that Israel's defenses against its enemies were anything less than impenetrable? People were so shocked that they actually went as far as to push conspiracy theories about how the attack could have happened, implying that it was an inside job or that there was some stand-down order, none of which are backed by any evidence at all, by the way, but people just needed to justify to themselves what happened because the attack shattered everything we thought we knew about Israel's seemingly impenetrable defenses. What all the inquiries and evidence are showing so far is something that a lot of people don't actually want to admit, which is that the main reason this attack was able to happen was because of a deep level of arrogance. We completely underestimated Hamas, and it feels so silly to say something like arrogance is what led to this catastrophic security failure, but the reality is we saw the signs, we brushed them off, and we assumed that there was no way Hamas would ever follow through with something like this. And to be fair, security assessments are incredibly hard to judge. There's no formula that tells you when a threat is real, when it's posturing, and when it's worth mobilizing and risking the lives of hundreds of soldiers. Take Hezbollah, for example. We've known for years that they too planned a version of October 7th in the north. They too are planning infiltrations, kidnappings, and takeovers of communities. The intentions are there and they're clear, but intentions alone are not enough to launch a massive preemptive operation. The IDF has to evaluate how credible each threat is, how imminent it seems, and whether acting on it would risk more lives than it saves. This is what happened with Hamas in Gaza, and this week's new findings show just how deeply we underestimated them. A new report that was released on Sunday revealed that during the October 7th massacre, Hamas actually knew how to operate Israeli tanks. It turns out that in the Merkava 4 tanks, which are the IDF's most advanced armored vehicles, there is a secret shutdown button inside of the tank, which, when you press it, it completely disables the tank. This kill switch, as you call it, was supposed to be highly classified, but somehow Hamas knew about it and was able to neutralize the tanks around the Gaza envelope, especially in the Nahal Oz base, where 53 soldiers were killed and 10 were taken hostage. And for months, the IDF could not figure out how Hamas knew this button existed. Then, fast forward to early 2024, the explanation was found inside of a major underground Hamas compound known as the Pentagon, ironically. It turns out Hamas collected all of this through, wait for it, social media. They spent years monitoring nearly 100,000 IDF soldiers online, tracking their photos, videos, training clips, outpost footage, and seemingly harmless content. They infiltrated private WhatsApp groups, and they used fake profiles and befriended soldiers and officers, and even those with restricted accounts. This allowed them to follow soldiers from the day they were recruited until the day they became a commander, giving Hamas detailed information on bases, units, and movement patterns. And the network behind this effort was massive. About 2,500 Hamas operatives, and the intelligence gathering is believed to have gone on for about 5 years, starting in 2018. They analyzed everything: soldiers' TikTok videos, footage from ceremonies, deployment clips, and they used it to construct a precise operational model of IDF outposts. The report says that Hamas collected millions of data points to piece together this full intelligence picture. And they didn't just gather information, they built an entire operational plan around it. Hamas Nukhba units trained for years to operate tanks using full-scale mock-ups and advanced simulation software. Hamas built incredibly accurate models of military bases, including exit and entries, camera placements, armory locations, and even the location of the emergency response unit. Officials say that Nukhba terrorists could literally put on VR headsets in Gaza and rehearse their infiltration of each outpost. Documents seized during and after October 7th show just how exposed Israel really was. Hamas knew base layouts, internal gates, weaknesses in the barrier, and even technical details of the tanks. They also produced daily intelligence reports tracking IDF routine, the exact positions of every company, Iron Dome batteries, and any troop movements, including covert shifts between sectors. Their ultimate goal was to capture tanks and bring them back into Gaza to use against Israeli forces. Now, obviously, they didn't manage to capture any, but they did manage to disable a lot of them, and that alone was enough to change the battle on October 7th. Now, all of this in itself is crazy when you think about the level of research and sophistication it took to plan this massacre out, from Hamas no less. But what adds another layer to the intelligence failure is that Israel saw Hamas training but dismissed it as theatrics or showmanship. Israeli forces were aware that Hamas had built these mock-ups, but a senior officer admits, quote, "We never imagined how accurate they were." Another officer who served for years on an Air Force base and then later had to come back and review Hamas's raid plan for that same base said, quote, "Hamas knew the base better than I did, even years after serving there." This is really wild. So, no, there is no evidence of an inside job or a stand-down order. But there's plenty that suggests that we were living in a fairy tale and thinking that Hamas could never pull something like this off, and myself included. I think that this is part of the trauma that many of us in Israel who lived through October 7th have, is that with each update and each video and each live stream from that day, it just kept getting worse and worse and shattered what we thought we knew. I saw video footage of terrorists in Sderot, and I said, okay, it's a small amount of terrorists who broke through the barrier. But then I saw videos of them killing and abducting a soldier. And then I see photos of dead tourists who were waiting at a bus stop to head to the Dead Sea. Then footage from the Nova Festival. Then phone calls from people who were hiding in their bomb shelters. Then watching them parade Shani Luke's body in Gaza. Every time I told myself, okay, this is really bad. But I foolishly thought that it was still contained. It just kept getting worse and worse. Everything I thought I knew about Israel's security was shattered in one day. Before October 7th, I visited the Gaza border plenty of times. And for those of us who have been there, in certain areas of the border, you can quite literally see Gaza so easily that you can just walk there. My best friend lives in Netiv Asara, and you're about 1 kilometer away from Beit Lahia or Beit Hanun. And despite this proximity, I never thought something like October 7th was possible. Then, weeks after the massacre, I went into the kibbutzim. I was in Kfar Aza, and I walked to the area of the fence that Hamas had breached, and I stood there looking at Gaza, at Jabalia, and I was like, how did this not happen sooner? How could I have been this foolish to think that something of this scale was impossible? And so arrogance or ignorance, whatever you want to call it, had a heavy hand here. Now, back to the Commission of Inquiry. And moving aside how someone feels about the current Israeli government, the fact that we have gone over 2 years without one is honestly unacceptable. And I'm not sure how any public of any other country would have tolerated 2 years without an investigation. I'm not really sure who is to be held responsible for October 7th, whether it's the political or security leadership or both, quite frankly. But one of the policies that the government should be held responsible for was the Qatari suitcases of cash that were being transferred every month to Hamas. Now, I myself have not seen the documents, but other journalists that I trust have. And these documents prove that Israel had asked Qatar to send Hamas $30 million every month. Qatar has been a key financial supporter of Hamas, transferring over $1.8 billion to the terror group over the years. And this was the policy of various Netanyahu governments throughout the years. And quite frankly, I don't hold him exclusively accountable because from what I understand, the Bennett-Lapid government, when they were in power, did a different version of the same thing. It seems that all of Israel supported this policy of containment and that if we would get into these skirmishes with Hamas over the years, so long as the money was coming to them, and so long as we had the superior military and technological edge, we could deal with them. And for years we did. I would believe that the justification for that would be that Israel felt that there were bigger and more pressing enemies to deal with. In comparison to Hezbollah or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Hamas is much weaker, limited in their weapon stockpiles, and in comparison to other enemies, they are a guerrilla or terrorist organization versus a conventional army, or so we thought. So the policy of containment worked. We had the technology like the Iron Dome or the Iron Wall that prevented mass casualties in Israel by the terror group. So this was more or less supported by the security and the political leadership. I mean, they are all responsible, in my opinion. And we spoke in detail about what the IDF uncovered inside of Gaza. But what were some of the signs leading up to the massacre that were complete red flags? First off, we know that for months leading up to the attacks, the women that were stationed around the Gaza border, known as the observers, began to see practice raids, mock hostage taking, and farmers behaving strangely on the other side of the fence. Even though these women were communicating that Hamas was planning something, their warnings went ignored by the higher-ups. Then there were the SIM cards. Palestinian phones inside of the Strip function from a network in Gaza, but on Friday, October 6th, 100 Israeli SIM cards went live inside of Palestinian phones. The Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, sees this and pretty much ignores it. From what we understand, just a year prior, Hamas had done something very similar where they used about 30 to 40 Israeli SIM cards that went live. So the Shin Bet just assumed that this is one of Hamas's annual drills. There was also underground rocket launchers that Hamas started to uncover in the middle of the night. And we know now that this is how they would begin their invasion, by firing a barrage of at least 4,300 rockets at Israel. But when Israel intercepted the phone calls inside of Gaza, particularly between Hamas and Islamic Jihad, from what the reports say, Islamic Jihad says, "Are you guys planning something?" And Hamas flat out says, in these conversations, no, it's just a drill. We're just practicing. Then Hamas starts preparing underground bunkers for some of its top commanders. And Israeli senior military staff are seeing this and are in contact with one another about it. Ironically, they were not in contact with Netanyahu. What is so upsetting was that a call was set up on October 7th for 7 a.m., when we know now that the invasion started at 6:29 a.m. We spent all this time thinking that our qualitative edge meant that our defenses were impenetrable. Our leaders thought money could contain a terror organization, and we were arrogant and ignorant because we were living in a fantasy where we thought a terror organization whose stated goal was the annihilation of the state of Israel would not follow through on what they promised. Meanwhile, inside of Gaza, Hamas was carrying out a meticulous long-term preparation for this unprecedented attack. Now, to play devil's advocate, one of my favorite Israeli journalists, Amit Segel, brought up a quote from Eli Zira, who was a major intelligence general in the IDF, who many in Israel blame for the intelligence failure of the Yom Kippur War. Now, Zira just passed away a couple of days ago. May he rest in peace. But a quote from him that Amit brought to my attention goes as follows. After the Yom Kippur War, I dug and investigated, and this is what I discovered. Whoever sought to surprise the enemy always succeeded. Israel did, so did Egypt, so did Syria, so did many countries around the world. Every time an army wanted to achieve a surprise, it succeeded. And the flip side of the coin, every time an army or a country relied on prior intelligence warning, it failed. If you are a chief of staff, defense minister, or prime minister, assume that you will not receive a warning. Therefore, a fundamental change is needed regarding prior warnings, and we must examine how to safeguard the security of the state without relying on receiving warning to be operationally prepared for every scenario. For me, an independent commission of inquiry is necessary, not because I need someone to blame, but because Israel cannot afford any more containment policy or leaders who underestimate our enemy. We need to never allow ourselves to fall back into this complacent belief that our enemies won't follow through on their promises. So, as we close out today's episode, here's the bottom line. Israel cannot afford another failure built on arrogance, wishful thinking, or political convenience. A state commission of inquiry won't fix everything, but it's the first step towards rebuilding trust in our institutions, in our leadership, and in ourselves. That's what this conversation is really about. Thank you for joining me on Off the Record, where we are trying to bring back nuance, context, and real conversations to a space that desperately needs it. Comment your thoughts and questions below, and if you're interested in more episodes like this, hit subscribe.